We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Coming up this week,
World War III, Part 94.
as the first ever intermediate-range ballistic missile to be fired in anger lands on Ukraine, it's more than just a world historic event in the evolution of arms. It's a shot across the bows for the broader West.
How do we stall this one out? Right now, our leaders are a gorilla holding a ming vase. Given their overall skill levels, will we make it without losing our eyebrows in the white heat of a nuclear blast?
In part one of this week's special edition, we'll be considering the US-Ukrainian missile attacks that kicked off the present round of tit-for-tat.
In part two, we'll be considering the retaliatory threat of the Russian Oreshniks.
And in part three, we'll be considering the overall playbook for World War III.
But first,
From Ukraine with love. Multipolarity listeners can hardly have failed to have noticed that in the dying days, the dog end of his presidency, Joe Biden gave authorization to Ukraine to fire ATACMS missiles into Russia proper, i.e. the 1991 internationally recognized boundaries. As obedient satraps do, both Britain and France quickly followed with authorization to fire Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, which are the same missile but just under different names for Britain and France respectively, into Russia as well. This is a significant escalation of the West's conduct in the war, and has clearly and obviously crossed red lines set by Russia, and therefore risks the entire conflict escalating perhaps outside Ukraine and perhaps out of control altogether. It seems to me, at least, that this is a really dangerous moment, probably the most dangerous moment in the world since the Able Archer exercise in 1983, and perhaps even as far back as the Cuban Missile Crisis, although I don't believe we're quite there yet.
yeah, I'm really surprised at this. Obviously, Starmer has been going around trying to launch World War III for a while now. Guy is a complete mess. His approval ratings underground. I mean, like, if there's ever anyone that you get that old soul that, you know, somebody, a politician in a deeply unpopular state might go around and try and launch a absolutely lunatic war, that would apply to Keir Starmer. Of course, Keir Starmer is a Guardian lovey, or at least was, so you're not allowed to say that about him, because we live in this weird world these days where you're not allowed to talk about things or point out like absolutely lunatic behavior or people's deep unpopularity and bad motivations and all, you know, all the things you used to point out in like 2017 when Donald Trump was president and he wasn't actually doing anything that crazy. I mean, some of the decisions weren't great, but he never did anything like this crazy. Anyway, Starmer had been going around trying to whip up support for this for a while. I don't think we even covered it on the show. It was kind of like a stupid diplomatic flub by Britain. And that's how I kind of read it. I said, you know, this guy's desperate. Everyone hates him in Britain. He wants to try and get some sort of a win. Like, there's probably nefarious forces winding him up behind the scenes, etc., etc. And I thought, for that reason, he was just, you know, some cat's paw wound up by DC, and that it would never happen, because the Biden administration kept coming out and saying no, and they also said how dangerous it was. Now, people can go and say, oh, well, they did the same about sending F-16s, about sending ATACMS in the first place, all that. Look, all that stuff wasn't relevant, and I hope Multipolarity listeners will appreciate that, because we never covered it. Like, I think both of us saw that for what it was. It was like all this, like, Western hype stuff, like, we're sticking it to Russia, we're doing whatever we want. This is actually, as you say, a clear red line set by the Russians, because it's attacks of these missile systems on Russia that are directed by effectively Western ISR. So they're direct strikes. I mean, they're supervised strikes on Russian territory. It's a clear act of war in a sense, or at least it's almost a clear act of war. So it seemed completely different to me than the F-16s or whatever the Abrams, as if Putin cares if they sent F-16s or Abrams to get completely obliterated in Ukraine. They never cared. The Russians laughed at them when they did it. But this isn't that. This isn't that at all. And so I didn't think it would happen. I thought that there were level heads, that there were high people who were willing to push things to the brink in Ukraine, who may not have had the same moral values that I consider important, caring about people's lives, caring about global stability. They may have been gamblers. We could say all these things about the various creatures that staff the Biden administration, but I thought at the end of the day that they'd be willing to back down at a certain point. And I think what the permission to use these long-range missiles and the consequences, which we'll talk about shortly, have disproved that. They're not actually rational people. I can't see them as being rational anymore. These are desperate gamblers. These are like the guy who's down to his last couple of chips, but he needs to win the money back, and so he's taking out a mortgage on his house. And he's putting the money on the table, and he's saying to himself, if I don't win the money back, I'm screwed, so I might as well just remortgage the house. And we're in the position of being the family that lives in the house, and we're watching this guy go to the casino, and we're like, well, I don't know what to do. He's got the deeds to the house. I can't really stop him. I mean, that's literally the situation we're in right now.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's an excellent analogy, Philip, and it's one that I would agree with. In the last few days, I've been trying to think about what their motivation might be, because I mean the US administration, or certainly their main foreign policy cheerleaders in the media, have been very clear that they don't believe this will change the war. I don't think there's anybody on earth who would seriously argue that a few ATACMS, because there aren't so many left available for Ukraine to fire, and a few Storm Shadow and Scalps, and again, there's not so many for Ukraine to fire, are going to actually change this war. They're not going to lead to a Ukraine victory as Ukraine has defined it. It might temporarily slow Russia down, but given, as I said, there are only a few of these missiles, some of them will be shot down by Russian anti-air, it seems highly unlikely that it will change anything at all in strategic terms. It might change things tactically a little bit, but as I say, and I'll repeat again, everybody who I've seen, whether they're very much in favor of the current US administration, whether they're swiveled-eyed, neoconservative British media lunatics, everybody admits that this will not change the strategic situation within the war. So why take such a risky step? Why do it? I've got a couple of suggestions. The first suggestion is basically that it's the end of the Biden administration. Trump is going to come in, and these people are so emotionally committed to this war, which they have driven, and they have rejected multiple opportunities to negotiate a peace. They're so emotionally committed, and they're so afraid of what it'll do for their reputation if they have to conclude a peace agreement, or if a peace agreement is concluded, that they've decided to try to screw with Trump. They've decided to try to make it really difficult for him to negotiate. They've decided that, well, look, what we'll do is we'll send these weapons, because this would have been a big bargaining chip for Trump, because Trump could have said, look, he could have said to Russia, look, if you don't come to the table and negotiate with us, then I'm going to authorize these weapons onto Russian soil. Well, now that bargaining chip's gone. There's just one less card for Trump or his proxies to play when negotiating with Russia. Maybe things are just escalated too far for Trump to negotiate a peace. So maybe it's that. Maybe they're trying to screw Trump. Or maybe this is like the Germans withdrawing from France in 1918. They realized that they've lost the First World War, and as they retreat back into Germany, they just start demolishing everything, every bit of infrastructure, every factory, every coal mine, every steel mill, every bridge, everything that they can find. They basically salt the economic earth on the way out. Maybe it's that. Maybe they're just like, okay, here's everything we've got, guys. If you're going to lose, at least do plenty of damage to Russia. At least kill some Russians. Maybe it's that. But given this won't change the strategic calculus, as is well admitted, it's really difficult to wonder, to imagine a reason for doing this, a reason for taking such a risk that is other than wanting to make it more difficult for Trump to negotiate a peace agreement, or just literally salting the earth on the way out. I mean, maybe you've got some better ideas, Philip.
I don't. I think those are the possibilities. I don't think there really are any possibilities unless, like, there's, like, some evil dark lord at the bottom of, like, some basement, like Wizard of Oz, pulling the strings, and, like, he's, you know, surrounded by, like, bat creatures or something, and he's got an evil plot to blow up the world. Like, that really is the only alternative, and, like, I don't know, at this stage I'm not averse to it, because this is so absolutely bonkers. I think it's probably one of yours. I mean, maybe it's the crazy bat guy as well, like, who knows, some sort of Bond villain or something at this stage. But, you know, look, it's, joking aside, it's probably one of yours, right? It's probably one of those, or it's a combination of them. Here's the real question that then raises, just from a purely psychological point of view, because we really are at the point now where you feel like you don't have any control over this situation. It's insanely dangerous. It's despicable. As you say, there's no rationale for it. It's really, for anyone who's like an educated person watching this, it's absolutely horrifying. It's shameful, actually, to be in the West and to be part of this. It's really depressing, even beyond being kind of scary and everything like that. But the other question that it kind of raises to me, and I like the way you brought up World War I there, because I think it's kind of analogous to it in a way, that, like, say you're Joe Biden, right? Or say you're Anthony Blinken, or Jake Sullivan. Keir Starmer, maybe not. The people say he doesn't have an internal life, and I'm starting to believe it. Macron, though, definitely Macron. Say you're these people. Do you not care about your legacy at all? Like, this is going to be your legacy, guys. Macron's not going to go down for, like, reforming French politics like he wanted to. His parliament's in a state. It's in a complete mess. He's made a mess of France. Everyone sees that. Joe Biden is widely known, even at this stage, as being one of the worst presidents in American history. Jake Sullivan, who presumably prides himself on being a foreign policy genius, he's presided over the worst loss of American power post World War II. Okay, so you already have all these negative strikes against you, and then you go, you know what? I'm going to go down in history as the guy who almost started World War III. Why would you want to do that for no discernible gain? That really baffles me. When you look at someone, okay, maybe Biden's out to lunch. Maybe he's actually so demented now that he can't think anymore about his legacy. Macron can think about his legacy, like, clearly, like, he's still compos mentis. I'm increasingly thinking he's a little crazy, but, you know, he's compos mentis and he's egotistical. Jake Sullivan, ditto. Like, I wouldn't say he's egotistical like Macron, but, like, he considers himself an intellectual, a Kissinger-like figure, whatever. Blinken seems kind of dumb, I'm not going to lie. I've always thought Anthony Blinken was kind of dumb. But, you know, the other guys, like, you really want this to be your legacy? I can't get my head around that part of it. Merv the Swerve.
So about a month or so ago now, I wrote a short piece, which I put up on Twitter as a thread, about how we can connect. I think I listed like 4 or 5, ostensibly unrelated, but equally baffling political actions, certainly in Britain, but I'm sure it would apply to America as well. And what I said was that a political class is gripped by what I call the adolescent mindset. So when we think about what the adolescent mindset is, you know, we think of teenagers and how they act and how they behave. So the first thing is that they're quite often characterized by a lack of emotional control. You know, they'll burst into tears or have like fits of anger and tantrums, almost like a child, but a bit more kind of violently so because they're adolescents, they're not little kids anymore. They tend to swing in their mood between a kind of like hubristic triumphalism, like totally confident that nothing in the world can stop them and they're just like amazing and the world is their oyster. And then, you know, literally the next day they'll be set by like pits of the earth hopelessness and like life is just not fair and there's nothing I can do and I might as well die, right? They also tend to combine like callowness and at the same time certitude, like within the same opinion. So, you know, they'll say things that betray like an utter lack of wisdom, But at the same time, they're absolutely certain in their view that it's right, despite the fact that it's obviously a very naive opinion. They also have like a lack of responsibility and quite often like a refusal to take responsibility. Like they won't accept that by doing X action, there will be X consequence. Like, and they especially won't do it if it seems to them unfair. Like, well, that's not fair. Like, just because I do this is going to happen. How is that fair? No, I should be able to do this if I want. The other thing is, like, teenagers are like risk takers. They do stupid things. Like they get absolutely drunk. They take drugs. They try and jump between one building and another for Instagram. They get involved in risky one-night stands and all of those sort of things, like risk taking. And the final thing is, like, adolescents tend to get really obsessed and really passionate about big, abstract, distant causes and ignore kind of simple, small, mundane things close to home. So the big example of that is Jordan Peterson's, where he said, like, how are you going to solve climate change when you can't even keep your room tidy? Okay? But that is a kind of good example. Your average teenager is convinced that they know how the Palestinian-Israel problem should be solved. Okay, but they can't pluck up the courage to ask a girl out on a date. Or you see teenagers out there trying to fight for the third world and raise money for the third world, but you never see teenagers out there campaigning to have potholes filled in or litter picked up off the street or graffiti washed off walls. Do you know the difference, right? So, I mean, I think that, if you think of those attributes of the adolescent personality and you look at actions that politicians take, which are otherwise baffling, then things start to fit. I mean, one of the examples I used, and this will be something that both our American and our British listeners could understand, that the Labour government, or individuals and groups and activists associated with Labour government, including some very closely associated with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer himself, actively campaigned for and consulted and aided the Kamala Harris campaign. And they also had a kind of an NGO, a think tank, or an activist group, which was co-founded by Sir Keir Starmer's chief of staff, and still actually shares an address with Keir Starmer's chief of staff's major Labour Party action group. Okay, you had that running this kind of black hat campaign to destroy Elon Musk through various lawfare means and various social media activities. Now, you would have thought that they would have considered for a second, hang on a second, we're now in government, okay? Or we're about to be in government. And if Donald Trump is elected, he's going to be hacked off at the fact that we've done this. And he might be the president of our biggest ally, the guarantor of our security, our biggest trade partner of any single nation. That might be bad for Britain, but they didn't. They didn't consider that at all. They believed that it was right for them to campaign for Kamala Harris. You have the foreign secretary calling the president of the United States a racist, a member of the Ku Klux Klan supporting racist, a fascist, all of these names. The foreign secretary calling him all these names, okay? Did he not think for a second, like, one day I might be in power and Donald Trump might be elected, I might have to deal with this guy in Britain's interest? No, he didn't. It's like, no, this is right, I have a duty. Like, the consequences, well, like, why should I have to deal with consequences? Now, apply this adolescent mindset, Philip, to what's going on in Ukraine and what's gone on in Ukraine since 2014. I think a lot of Western politicians, when you listen to them, they're just gripped by the adolescent mindset. Like, you hear a lot of them say, well, why shouldn't we provide, weapons to hit Russia? Russia started it. But, like, adults, like, okay, you might think you're in the right, but even if you're in the right, your response to a situation has to take into account the consequences of that response, right? Like, if you're going to sanction a natural resources superpower and the provider of your energy upon which your whole industry depends, then you've got to think of the consequences of those sanctions. But no, sanctions are the right thing to do. No, sending missiles is the right thing to do. Like, it's fair, it's right, I am right, I'm completely convinced that I'm right, and there's nothing, this is a very adolescent mindset, Philip, and I think that if we imagine politicians to essentially be adolescents, and imagine the way that an adolescent would respond to any event, including the events that have happened in Ukraine, I think that explains a lot about the behavior of Western leadership.
Well, there's been a response, of course, to the sanctioning of the long-range attack missiles. I mean, I suppose I should probably just say there's been a few attacks with these missiles. It's not going to do anything. It's just the fact that it's striking Russian territory. And so I think, as you said in the previous segment, they can't allow, you can't allow that to stand because you need to make a response. The logic of escalation that we've talked about in the context of the Middle East many times before. So the Russians, in response to this, have done something quite dramatic, relatively controlled, thankfully, for now anyway. They've launched a new missile system, an intermediate-range ballistic missile called the Oreshnik. They've only released the name afterwards. This is basically a top-secret missile, in a sense, and it is interesting technologically, as I'll get into in a minute. This isn't all show and tell. They've launched this Oreshnik missile, which would usually be an intermediate-range nuclear missile with a MIRV, so it has multiple warheads. We'll get into that in a moment. They launched this on some sort of a factory. I've heard conflicting reports that it was some industrial base, that it potentially was a missile factory. I don't know. I'm not sure, but it was in Dnipro. It was in eastern Ukraine, so it wasn't like they struck Lvov or Western Poland or anything like that. Eastern Poland, I should say. So they launched this Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile on this base or on this factory, and there's been a lot of video of it. Actually, not as much video as we're used to from the Iranian strikes, but quite a bit of video. And so we actually know an awful lot about this missile, at least if you're following the right people. I am taking most of this analysis, or all of it pretty much, from Professor Ted Postel, who I've talked about on the show before. Actually, last time I talked about him, I had a slight disagreement with what he was saying, but on this one, I mean, he's beyond my capacities in terms of this sort of analysis. And he's an MIT professor, or he might be emeritus at this stage, but he worked with DoD. I mean, he's a professional missile analyst. He's, somebody that the government used to consult. And basically, here's what we know about the Oreshnik. It is 100% a intermediate range ballistic missile, which means it is pretty much exactly the same as an ICBM, the famous one that everyone knows about, an intercontinental ballistic missile. It just has a shorter range. So an ICBM can fly intercontinentally, obviously, from Russia to the United States. An intermediate range missile can fly from Russia into Europe. That's all that's required. Obviously, it was a MIRV, which means a multiple independent reentry vehicle, which means basically sitting on top of the missile are a bunch of different kind of almost cluster munitions. But they're not just cluster munitions. They break off and they enter atmosphere independently, and they effectively become independent missiles, and they can hit independent targets. And what a MIRV is designed to do is basically you fire one or two of these things at a country, the MIRVs break away, and the nuclear missiles that are presumably on the heads of these things blow up every single city in the entire country. MIRVs also mean that because the munition effectively breaks up, they become impossible, even if they weren't going so fast, which we'll get into the hypersonic nature of it in a moment. They're impossible to shoot all these things down because there's a ton of them coming at you at once. So even if you can figure out how to shoot down like 2 nuclear ballistic missiles or something like that, if you fire 3 MIRVs with, 6 warheads on each, you've got 18 warheads coming down at you, and good luck. But that's not even the most interesting thing about the weapon. The final, very interesting thing, which you may not have heard about, and you may not hear about it unless you're listening to the right people, is that it's fairly certain that this was a hypersonic glide vehicle. I think we've talked about hypersonic glide vehicles on the show before, or at least I did in my interview with Aaron Bastani. These are technology that the West don't possess. The way a ballistic missile works is it's fired into the atmosphere, and it fires in a parabolic axis. It goes up, and then it's pulled down by gravity, and it makes kind of an N shape. And what's good from an air defense point of view about a ballistic missile is it's a predictable trajectory, obviously, because it goes up, and then at any time when you pick that up on your early warning radar, you can say, well, we kind of know where that's going to land, and we kind of know what path it's going to. Now, you have to deal anyway with the speed. It's still kind of hard to hit because of the speed. But in theory, you can hit it. A hypersonic glide vehicle does something completely different. It goes out of the atmosphere, and the moment that it hits the atmosphere, it releases this thing that kind of looks like a spaceship. And what it does is it bounces along the top of the atmosphere, and it steers. It steers in random directions while it's doing it. And this gives it extra range, extra speed, and it maneuvers very slightly, but in such a way that it becomes completely unpredictable. Again, I'd go and check out the interview with Ted Postel if you want a walkthrough of it in a very technical way. But you can see these videos that have been released, and it's completely bizarre. You'll know what a plane looks like in the sky, but this thing looks completely different. It's flying vertically in the sky, but clearly much higher than the plane. And I think Postel's right. I don't think there's any explanation for it other than they fired a hypersonic glide vehicle. So what does that mean? Well, it means two things. First of all, I should have said before, the Russians gave like 10 minutes warning to the West, apparently. That's what's been reported. And they said, it's not a nuke, don't worry. And like, it was literally, they got a text message or something through the early warning system. It was like, not a nuke, don't worry. Nobody knew if the Russians were telling the truth or not, by the way, on that, just to make you feel incredibly safe in your bed tonight. No one has a clue with these things. Early warning radar can't tell you if there's nuclear tips on the thing. They can't even tell you probably what it is at first. People have to analyze the data and everything like that. But this thing came in about 10 minutes, and if it was a hypersonic glide vehicle, the radar that picked it up would have never seen anything like this before. The people who are operating that radar they might have, if they were well-trained and so on, known what it was after a few minutes, but they would have been like, yeah, we can't track this thing properly, we don't know where it's going to hit, it's moving in all sorts of weird directions. So it scared the bejesus, as we say in Ireland, out of everybody who was watching it. I'm sure the briefs that were given the next morning were somber, shall we say. And the final thing I'd say is, there's been a question for some time whether hypersonic glide vehicles actually exist. The Russians claim to have one, and the Chinese claim to have one. And there have been tests. We don't know a great deal about the tests because they're presumably classified. I've always thought that they do exist on balance, and I have my reasons for thinking that. Well, I'm pretty sure, if Postel's analysis is correct, and I'm pretty sure it is, the Russians have a hypersonic glide vehicle. We now know that. And any notion that they may or may not or anything like that, I think is definitely for the professional analysts that have all the early warning radar and stuff, they'll know now. They'll know for sure. But I think even Postel's analysis using the publicly available data is pretty convincing. So I think we can say fairly certainly now that they have a hypersonic glide vehicle. What does that mean? It means they can hit anything they want. Conventionally or nuclear, they can hit absolutely anything they want. There's absolutely no air defense against these things. Like, there's zero. And they're extremely precise, as we've seen. All the munitions, I think there were 6 breakaway clusters or something, and each of them had like 3 or 4 munitions or something. All of them hit the factory. You can see the video on it. So these things are incredibly precise. So basically, Russia have signaled that, first of all, they can wipe out Europe, I mean, pretty easily with nuclear weapons. We have no air defense against what they have. But even if they don't want to go nuclear, these things can strike conventionally. And I mean, these are like hand of God weapons. They're like lightning coming down. And they can just pretty much point it over any base they want in Europe. And the base will just be wiped out. They don't even need to use nukes. Because it's not only the explosive charge that does the damage, it's how fast the thing's moving. It's moving at 10 to 12 times the speed of sound. That's 4 kilometers a second. I mean, even just the impact, if you know Newtonian physics, the impact of that just in terms of speed is absolutely enormous. And then they stick a big warhead on top of it. So they can obliterate absolutely anything in Europe, probably in America actually too, but we're currently talking about Europe. They can obliterate anything, hand to God style, any base, anywhere, at any time with 10 minutes warning. And by the way, that means you can't get your planes up in the air. You can't do anything. You either have to keep your planes, if you have an airfield, and we'll talk about some of the assets that could be hit. If you have a bunch of planes, for example, the British have a bunch of planes in Cyprus. If you have like 20 minutes early half an hour early warning, you can get those planes up in the sky and they won't be hit. It's probably what happened in Israel when the Iranians launched their strike. If you have 5 to 10 minutes, no, you're not getting those planes up. You're evacuating the base. You're not trying to get the pilot to climb into the plane. You don't have time. You're evacuating the base. Everything will get obliterated. So I think this was a very, very strong signal. We've learned a lot about Russian capabilities, and it's sorted the man from the boys in terms of what people say now about whether they have hypersonic glide vehicles or not.
What's really important to understand here is that they had to respond. Like, they had to. And this is what was so dangerous about giving, Ukraine authorization to use the ATACMS, the Storm Shadows, and the Scalps in Russia proper in the first place, because it forced Russia to respond. Like, they set a red line. That was the red line. So if you cross that red line, they're faced with two choices. They completely destroy whatever credibility they had and allow you to escalate further and further and further, or they have to respond. And it's obvious what was going to happen. They were going to have to respond in some way. And what they did actually was quite measured, I would say. It was essentially a warning. It was the diplomatic equivalent of getting a bulletproof vest with two fishes inside, right? It wasn't taking out the British airbase at Cyprus, for example. It wasn't allowing the Houthis or providing the Houthis with targeting information to shower a US base in Syria with munitions that would have killed American soldiers. No, it was a warning. It was saying, this is a weapon that we've got. I think it's time to be careful now, don't you? That's what it was. But they had to respond in that case. I think in this case, that's the most important point to understand. If Russia somehow doesn't reestablish some kind of deterrence here, if the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps weren't responded to, then what would be next? Biden and Sullivan and Blinken would take the lack of response as an invitation to escalate further. It would be, they would start sending the JSSMs, which are a more sophisticated cruise missile, a more modern cruise missile. Perhaps they would take it as an invitation to send Tomahawk cruise missiles, which have much a longer range and a much heavier payload. Now, an ATACMS can do some damage to an airfield, but a Tomahawk cruise missile can put a whole factory out of action, or a whole bridge out of action, or a whole rail station out of action. They had to respond. Otherwise, the escalations would have just kept coming. And they will have to respond until deterrence is re-established and the escalation stops. And that's what makes this step so damn dangerous in strategic terms. And everybody, until recently, has understood exactly that. That's why you don't push the red lines of a nuclear power. It's clear. It's like the rules. You don't push the lines of a nuclear power because they will have to respond until the escalation stops, until you stop crossing red lines. But the problem I see here, Philip Pilkington, is that I don't see evidence that anybody in the West is wanting to stop. I don't see any evidence that they've received the message of Russia dropping the Oreshnik Dnipro. I just don't see that this message has been received. It's like, the scene in The Godfather where they open the parcel and it's the bulletproof vest with two fishes in. And instead of saying, it's an old Sicilian metaphor, it means Luca Brasi is swimming with the fishes. They're saying, I don't know what this is. That's weird. Tossing it aside and continuing what they were doing. It's incredibly dangerous.
Dr. Strangelove rides again. Well, all that logically leads to the question, are we going to make it to Trump's inauguration as president? I will say I've no doubt that Trump is going to shut this escalation down. Whether he manages to close down the war in 24 hours is another question, but I have no doubt Trump's going to put this back in the box. And that is part of the calculation of the lunatics that are playing with all our lives right now. So I think that's widely understood. The question is, will it get out of hand between now and then? We had our 100th episode special recently, and we got Gavin was very generous with our crystal ball gazing. On this one, I'd say we have absolutely no idea. I don't think it's in Russia's interest for multiple reasons to escalate this too far. Right now, the rest of the world is looking on at absolute horror. And they're looking on in horror not at Russia, they're looking on in horror at the West. They are looking at it the same way that we're looking at it, I guarantee that. Because they're assessing behavior in the same way that we're assessing behavior. And they don't understand why Western leaders are behaving like this. We're behaving like a rogue state. I mean, there's no other way to put it. We are behaving like a rogue state, but a very heavily armed rogue state. I mean, just to give some sense, I don't think North Korea behaves this irresponsibly. They make loads of threats, they fire off loads of, empty missiles, and they do all this heated rhetoric, but they don't actually, carry through on striking deep into South Korea with, MLRS or something like that. Like, they don't do it. So the rest of the world is looking at the West right now and saying, like, this place is a bunch of crazies are running the show here. As with what I said earlier in one of the earlier segments about people seemingly not caring about their legacy, we don't seem, at least the people running the West right now, don't seem to care about how they're viewed in the rest of the world. They don't seem to care about the impacts that this will have on diplomacy, on future economic relations, on influence within the UN or international institutions. Like, everything's just being tossed out the window. It's crazy at just about every level. But given all that, it's handing a massive potential win to Russia to play this one well for a couple of weeks and look really responsible. So I think that's actually probably what'll happen. That said, this could escalate further, whereas it might not get to nuclear war, whereas it might not get to World War III. It may escalate further. I alluded to it earlier that Russia could use these weapon systems like the Oreshnik or even lower caliber weapons to hit something like a British base in Cyprus. I just want to say a few things about that. The first is that if they did that, it would do permanent damage to those countries' capacity to project power. The British base in Cyprus, I don't know how much it's worth, but it's almost definitely worth a couple of billion. I'm guessing it's worth up to about 10 billion. The British were barely able to allocate an extra 3 billion in funding. I think it was 2.9 billion in the latest budget because the country is broke. It is flat broke. If Russia wiped out the base in Cyprus, it wouldn't be replaced. There's no money to replace it. And France aren't that much further behind. Listeners will remember that when Marine Le Pen looked like she was about to be elected, the French looked like they were going to burn the house down and create a bond market crisis. Now, look, we said at the time that was partly politicized, but you can't politicize it unless the country's already almost broke. And France is almost broke. I mean, that's just a fact. So these military assets, if they were hit, they probably wouldn't be replaced. Or is that worth it in the minds of a British, defense strategist or a French defense strategist relative to what they're apparently gaining from, I don't know, some combination of embarrass Putin or scorched earth strategy that you alluded to earlier? I mean, maybe they think it is. And the second component, well, I don't think they're thinking about it at all, actually, frankly. I think they're stuck in what you said to be an adolescent mindset, and they don't understand the consequences of the actions. Second point on that. If the Russians hit with a conventional weapon those bases in Europe, British and French bases I'm talking about. I'm not talking about German bases because the Germans haven't sent Taurus missiles. Scholz is saying no to sending Taurus missiles. If they hit French or British bases, the French and the British would have basically no means to respond. The French and British militaries aren't very serious anymore. If they send troops, I mean, what would they send? 5,000, 10,000 troops? That's about 5 to 10 days worth of troops to get chewed up in the Donbass region. And the losses within 2 days would be intolerable to the countries, and the government will probably collapse. Definitely in France it would. Britain, I don't even know how Starmer's still in the seat with the popularity ratings that he has. But they have no actual response. They can feed a few troops into the Donbass meat grinder, but it does nothing. Fly air sorties, well, if their base has just been hit in Cyprus, I don't know where they're going to fly from. And even if they did fly them in, Russian air defense is going to absolutely obliterate those planes because it's the most densely layered air defense system in the world is in Russia. You go and look at maps of air defense around the world. It's the most densely layered. And, they have S-400 systems there, which are some of the most advanced in the world. There's no plane's going to get through there. And then we talk about range. Russia's huge. We talk about this with Iran. The only response that they can have in response to getting a base in, for example, Cyprus, Oreshniks, is that they might launch nuclear missiles out of a Trident submarine. So they might start a nuclear war with Russia. Well, what happens in that instance? Britain ceases to exist. I mean, that's what would happen. It might get a few shots off in Russia, might take out a couple of cities, but Britain would cease to exist. Everyone in Britain would be dead. A couple of MIRVs, these intermediate range ballistic missiles, and everyone in Britain's dead. Everyone's dead. And then whoever's not dead probably wishes they were because they're going to starve to death. So, I mean, that is what we're dealing with here. So, okay, maybe if they hit with a conventional missile system, one of these targets that I'm talking about, the British or the French could go boohoo, crawl back to the Americans and say, do something about it. But what are they going to do at that stage? I mean, okay, they could then arm the Ukrainians with, as you said, JASSMs or something like that. The Russians would time this strike, obviously, think it through. Okay, so they get 2 weeks of even longer range strikes. Yeah, but then Trump gets in, he shuts it all down, and the Russians are like, okay, we took a couple more missile strikes to random sites, couple of 100 kilometers into Russia. So, like, there is actually a potential to escalate here without going to World War III that could do enormous damage to European defense. And that is another reason that I just do not get the thinking here.
I think one thing that many people are missing, actually, is that if, say, Britain and France, or Britain and a coalition of the willing, i.e. almost certainly the more hard line of the Eastern European states, if they got involved in the Ukraine war, certainly Britain on its own simply doesn't have the weight to make much of a difference on land. I suspect its tactical air power flying out of Romania and Poland would be pretty serious, and I suspect that while, again, that wouldn't change the strategic situation on the battleground, it wouldn't change the position, it might cause tactical problems for Russia, because that, the RAF is very small, but it's still pretty effective. The issue that people are missing here, though, is that if Britain and France, or just Britain, or Britain and a coalition of the willing got involved, it would actually open up a really big prize for Russia. It would open up the complete dissolution of NATO. Why is that? Well, if say, Britain put soldiers on the ground, troops on the ground, Russia would have to attack them. It would have to make a point that we're going to attack them and we don't care and this is unacceptable. If Britain can't really retaliate, or if it starts running out of ammunition, and don't forget that in a war game a couple of years ago with the French and the Americans, Britain ran out of a range of key munitions within 5 days. And that was a war game. That wasn't terror of the battlefield when you're expending every damn munition you've possibly got as fast as you've got to stop these guys who are trying to kill you closing in. Okay? That's a war game, and they ran out in 5 days. Since then, they've given a whole bunch to Ukraine. So what exactly they would be doing, I don't know, but they would have to be attacked. And if Uncle Sam doesn't then come and bail them out, if Uncle Sam doesn't stop them from being rolled over or respond to the fact that they've just been bombed and 130 British and French servicemen have been killed or injured in a single attack, then what does that make NATO exactly? I mean, does that not really put the whole premise of NATO under question? Does it not? So you're kind of like opening a prize here for Russia. And what that has the effect of doing, it's like in a game of poker. If you're holding a hand that you feel is 6-4 against winning, you might be like really not willing to take that risk for a certain pot size. But if you treble the pot size or quadruple the pot size, you might think, geez, this is now really worth taking a risk. It's worth taking the risk. And it might be a bit like that geostrategically. What they just haven't. In the last few days, I've heard reports that the British and French have reopened discussions about sending troops to Ukraine. I've heard reports that the Americans are considering sending their own cruise missiles. Now, whether that means JSOMs or Tomahawks, I don't know. But, usually when you hear that these discussions are taking place, it means that the missiles are already on the way. I've heard stories of increasing the weapon supplies. And not only that, but they've launched scores of these weapons into Russia since the Oreshnik attack. Now, let nobody be in any question here. I've seen a couple of people who have the knowledge and authority to say so, that the Ukrainians simply couldn't fire these missiles by themselves. It's not just the intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance information they need, but certainly for the Storm Shadows at least, the targeting data needs to be actually programmed into the missile before you put it under the wing of an aeroplane. It then needs to be flown. Does Ukraine have an air force at the minute? I don't know, but maybe they have. It needs to be flown and they need to press the button. But before then, you need to program that information in. Who's doing that? It's not the Ukrainians. So, you've got British and Americans finding these targets, programming all of the data in, and then just handing them these weapons across to Ukrainians to press a button. And Russia has given a response, a warning, and that's not been heeded. In fact, there's talk of further escalation. So I think this is a really dangerous thing. It's like the West is not getting the message. And it's part of a really long-running problem or attitude that the West has had to Russia. It's like when the West does things that Russia doesn't like, the West says, you see, this is, we can cross Russia's red lines. They might object to this, but they're not going to do anything to stop us. And they keep doing this and keep doing this and keep doing this. And then eventually Russia responds. And when Russia does respond, instead of saying, actually we're wrong, there is a limit here and we should stop here, they say, aha, you see how they react? They're completely irresponsible. We have to stand up to these people. And then the escalation increases and suddenly we're back to, you see, Russia's got no red lines. It's all bluff. It's all bullshit. And then Russia finally responds, aha, you see, we told you all along how aggressive they are. We've got to respond to this. And this is the double play that's at play here. And I see no evidence that that's changing whatsoever. So the Russians give this warning with this really dangerous weapon that's indefensible and is that nuclear capable. And it lands on top of a really important arms factory on the Dnieper River. So this is the time where we've proved that there are limits. They've sent us this warning, like, this far thou shalt go, but no further. Okay? But no, now it's like, oh, well, we can't back down now. We can't let, be seen to be bullied off this because that would spoil our credibility. Like, how far are we willing to take this attitude where it's like, heads, I can do what I want. Tails, I must do what I wanted anyway. If this keeps going, it's going to be really serious. I hope that there are serious people in America who can put a stop to this. I think there are. I think in places like the Pentagon, maybe even the State Department and the CIA, there are cooler heads who understand the calculus of dealing with a nuclear-armed power, okay? Who understand the calculus of great power security competition. But I'm not seeing it at the minute, and I'm getting increasingly concerned that such people have been sidelined.
Just really quickly, I'd say two things of kind of proactive decision-making. We haven't had Greta Thunberg on the show because we're not activists generally. I'm certainly not, and I don't like telling people what to do. Politicians do respond to being written to. This is a really serious situation. We have a bit of a following. It might be worth writing to your MP or your whatever the equivalent is in your country. Like, it does actually make a difference. They don't get that much in terms of intelligent letters. They get people complaining about potholes and stuff. It has a big impact. I've been around politicians. I know how much of an impact it has. There's a million points in this podcast you could write to them about. You could write to British MPs about the security of the cyberspace, whether they could pay for it if it got struck by an Oreshnik. You could write to people about nuclear war generally. All sorts of crazy good things are going to happen between now and the final close of Multipolarity, but I don't think it's going to get much more dangerous than this. So, if you're averse to the kind of Thunberg-style activism, I understand, but it might be worth it. Don't forget this. A history book's going to have to be written about this. And the people who are currently shaming themselves, frankly, will have to be remembered in that way. Andrew talked about World War I earlier, about the scorched earth policy of the Germans and so on. Let me just say that the German leadership toward the end of World War I have not gone down in a stellar way in history. They're kind of blamed for the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. So I'm not saying that they've crossed a line as bad as that our current leadership class have, but they're pretty much up there. So, might be worth keeping in mind as well. We don't have a great deal of power over the current situation, but maybe we have some influence on how it's remembered and the lessons that are taken from it.